Okay, so why don't we get started? I think I got this room till 10:30. I've learned I tend to talk fast, so there should be plenty of time towards the end for Q&A, and I also have some free time afterwards. So if anybody wants to chat after this room isn't free anymore, I'd be happy to continue the conversation. My name is Jonathan Haber. I am the MOOC guy. I'm the title of Chief Learner with Degree of Freedom, which has been, it's a name for my MOOC-related project, my own experiment in online learning that took place last year that tried to answer a number of questions about MOOCs, but I think the question that was framed for this particular session is, are MOOCs the equivalent of college courses? Okay, so we will answer that question towards the end, but I want to give you a sense of what my Degree of Freedom experiment was all about, so you'll understand what background I brought to the subject. So I like to kind of start these talks with a little Q&A based on some things I learned last year. So did you know that the government actually owns a right to your house? It owns the right to make nuclear weapons there, which it exercises negatively. Did you know that they have discovered over 700 planets called exoplanets orbiting other stars? This is my favorite. Did you know if you were on Let's Make a Deal, 3 doors, there's a car behind one door and goats behind the other 2. You pick door 1, Monty Hall opens up door 3 to reveal a goat there. You actually stand a much better chance of winning if you switch from door 1 to door 2. Okay, did anybody know like all 3 of those? Or 2? Or 1? Okay. So don't feel bad, I knew none of that until I took part in my own experiment in learning the Degree of Freedom, my 1-year BA. Okay, so this project actually arose from a different project I'd done. I had worked in professional assessment for both employers and education for a number of years, curriculum development, worked in educational publishing for a while, but in 2012 I developed my own curriculum, a curriculum to teach critical thinking that used the 2012 election as a case study to teach what I call practical critical thinking skills. It's still available. It's called Critical Voter. People are still downloading it and using it. But towards the end of that class, I provided a recommendation to students who were using it either in classroom or just listening to it as a podcast. I recommended that anybody who wanted to continue studying critical thinking further should probably take a formal logic class. My course touched on some areas of logic, but not nearly as in depth as you would get in a full semester course. And lo and behold, no sooner had I finished that course that I discovered a course for free from Duke University on critical thinking or critical reasoning and argumentation called Think Again. Welcome. Just for folks who are just entering, I'm just providing some background as to the Degree of Freedom 1-year BA project. That's the basis for some of the information that I'll be providing to you. So I discovered a free course from a company I never heard of called Coursera. It was a thing I never heard of called a MOOC. This is the end of 2012. And I figured, well, I might as well take my own medicine. I'd recommended other people take this course. I'll try it myself. And so I enrolled. And I should confess, I've always been a bit of a recreational learner. Sort of iTunes U courses tend to be on my iPhone rather than music. And so I treated this course like you would a sort of lecture course, an iTunes U course. I listened to lectures in the car, I listened to them at the gym, and then it came time to take my first quiz, my first exam, and I got an 80%, which is a little embarrassing because I just taught a course in this subject and I was getting a B-. But I thought, well, it's kind of an eccentric set of content at the beginning. Maybe that was it. So I took the next quarter of the course, which was on truth tables, and again got an 80%. Now at this point, my professional assessment training kicked in because I had created a certification back in the day on digital literacy, which had a cut score, a pass-fail score of 80%, which was the scientifically determined cut score between people who kind of had an understanding of material and who really knew it. That was those scores, while probably less formally developed, were telling me that I was a passive learner. I was absorbing the material, but not really learning it. So I decided, this is different. This is not the same as a lecture-only course. Let me take the second half of the course with a bit more rigor. And the second half, I treated like a real college course. I took notes during every lecture. I sat the exams, very carefully with a self-imposed time limit. And lo and behold, my scores for the second half of the exam were in the 90s, really reflecting the work I was putting into it. And so it dawned on me, this MOOC thing, is kind of interesting. This is not just, sort of great courses, you pop a CD in your car. There's some real college learning. This course was 14 weeks long. It was quite demanding, and I'd taken a logic course when I was in college many, many years ago, and this certainly seemed as rigorous as that course had seemed. So I decided to dig a little bit more into this whole MOOC thing, what it's all about. And that was the end of 2012, beginning that if everyone's been following MOOCs, that was the time that, Tom Friedman was still writing about the subject every other day. There was still talk in the air that this was going to revolutionize education. This was the great challenge to residential education and traditional learning. MOOCs were going to be able to educate the masses, educate the developed world, finally bring the cost of college down, solve all our educational problems. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting because I just took one of these courses and, I liked it actually, but it wasn't that good. I mean, it didn't seem like it was about to sort of like transform every educational experience. So, so I read some more and realized, the people who were sort of talking about all this excitement, they all had something in common. They'd never taken a course. Or if they had, maybe somebody taught one or had taken one or two, possibly to completion. But no one had really taken enough courses to get a sense of what it was all about. And it dawned on me, if we were going to really be able to understand this, then somebody had to take enough courses to make the equivalent of an actual degree program. So, enough courses and enough disciplines from enough vendors to really get a sense of what this MOOC thing was all about. And at that point, that phrase that tends to send shudders through my household was uttered, which was why not me? And so I decided I would dedicate 2013 to that project. I would dedicate 2013 to seeing if it was possible to learn the equivalent of a BA using only these free learning resources. Now, obviously there's a certain artificiality built into this project from the get-go in that I was doing something that normally takes 48 months and doing it in 12. There's a few reasons for that. Largely the information needed to get into the conversation now, not 4 years from now. But also it was a project that I didn't want to spill out over the next 4 years. I wanted to bound it, learn what I need to do, communicate out in ways I'll be describing. And so I set forth on coming up with a curriculum that would be the equivalent of a BA. Now I modeled this after the degree program I got at my university when I went to college years ago. It was a liberal arts college, and that required somebody to take 32 courses, of which your first 16 had to be spread over a distribution of 10 courses, 4 from either science, social sciences, and humanities, and 2 in the other, so standard distribution requirements, and a major. I needed a major that I would take 10 courses in, 2 of which would be at the intermediate, 2 at the advanced level. So that was the structure for my program, and my degree was going to be in philosophy. Okay, now, at this point, I started sort of searching out, who makes these courses, and obviously starting with the big 3, Coursera, edX, Udacity. When you talk about MOOCs, or certainly when we talk about MOOCs in 2012, 2013, discussion was built around these companies. But as I read through their catalogs, I realized, the first challenge is going to be they don't offer enough courses. They certainly don't offer enough philosophy courses at the advanced level. I knew I'd be running into some problems there. So for that reason, and also just to sort of expand things, I took a look at some other MOOC providers. Canvas, Instructures here, they have a MOOC platform, or something that can be called a MOOC platform, where they're offering courses for free. NovaEd is Stanford's platform, offering a number of business and technology courses. Those would certainly be considered MOOCs. Udemy is a course marketplace, online marketplace for courses, largely, professional and lifestyle courses, but some academic subjects as well. And then you have things which are clearly not MOOCs. Sailor.org is the Sailor Foundation is a group out of Washington. They offer over 200 courses in a variety of disciplines. Those courses are curated. Those are not offered as a prepackaged MOOC. They curate content from the open web. And then even iTunes U As I'll get into if there's time later, I think there could be a reasonable debate whether a MOOC is superior than other free learning sources. But this is a way to kind of expand the platform and really see what courses were available, what courses could be taken. So just sort of breezing through, my freshman year, remember my freshman and sophomore year had to be at least 16 courses, 10 of which would fall into the disciplines of a range of disciplines, humanities, social sciences, and sciences. There's my Coursera Think Again course, another Coursera course on the modern and postmodern taught by Michael Roth, president of the university. Actually, 2 Wesleyan courses. Property and liability was also a Wesleyan course. But Udacity courses, a course on statistics, and other courses, a course on startups. My sophomore year, I started taking edX courses, one on justice, taught by Michael Sandel, and a philosophy course in ethics, Ancient Greek Hero, that was a fairly famous MOOC, also from Harvard. But, courses on Einstein, a Canvas course on cheating in online courses. So these met my distribution requirements. For my major requirements, as I said, I needed more higher level philosophy courses. Coursera provided some. That Monty Hall problem, the 3 doors, that came from Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy, taught by 2 Germans, team teaching, and a course on Kierkegaard, taught by an American professor in the University of Copenhagen. I mentioned Saylor. That was a course I took on existentialist philosophy, where I wasn't actually sitting down for lectures each week. I'd be presented with a list of resources, lectures from iTunes U or YouTube or other places, readings to do, a set of questions I had to answer. And again, some courses from some other locations. My senior year, this is where, again, I was taking some edX courses, but really to kind of round out my philosophy degree, I did some self-study where I curated my own courses following the Saylor model on Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, on pragmatism, or pragmatic philosophy, America's only contribution to the philosophical canon, et cetera. A senior thesis I'll talk about in a second. And so that was my year. That was my 4 years compressed into one, was taking this many courses. Now the structure of the program was broken into each 3 months was 1 year. So each of those courses had to be taken January through March, April through June, July through September, October through the end of the year. In fact, I was January 8th is when I finished my courses with science and cooking. I was beating egg whites into the night so that I could sort of measure the volume fraction of air in them. That was my last assignment. But point of fact, on top of taking the courses, there was a superstructure of other assignments in that this was meant to communicate out what the experience was like. So the degreeoffreedom.org website included a blog where I was pretty much daily or week daily writing about my experience, but also writing about MOOCs in general, right? I've got a curriculum development experience. I've got professional assessment experience. We talked about how you can get credit for MOOCs, every angle possible. Actually, I highly recommend, if you ever really want to learn something, do nothing but that for a year, because write about it every day. Because to a certain extent, we'll talk about whether my 1-year BA is equivalent of a 4-year degree, but I would say certainly the work I put into my non-courses, be it this writing, interviews, et cetera, was probably the equivalent of a graduate degree in MOOCs. So, there was blogging about the subject. I did a weekly newsletter built around course reviews of the courses I just finished. It's now part of a portfolio. There was an interview series that I didn't want just my voice to be the only one in the mix. So I did a weekly podcast during this period where, Anant Agarwal, who will be giving the keynote tomorrow, was my first guest. Andrew Ung, one of the founders of Coursera, was my second. Sanjay Sarma, who's the oversees technology and learning for MIT. Peter Bohl, who's the provost for advances in learning at Harvard. They're all guests. Professors, Michael Roth, I mentioned, president of Wesleyan University. That's Greg Naj, one of the men behind the team behind Ancient Greek Hero, et cetera, as well as some students who had been doing some interesting things with education. So it was a way to kind of broaden the conversation beyond just my own experiences or my own reflections. I think I mentioned before my senior thesis. About halfway through the project, I got a call from MIT Press, who were interested in doing a book on MOOCs. and they wondered if I would write it. I said, yes, I would. When do you want it? They wanted it by the end of last year, so I basically turned that into my senior thesis, where I treated it like a course and wrote a book on MOOCs. A lot of these reflections you're hearing right now will be in this book that'll be out at the beginning of October. But it was a way to kind of consolidate a sort of year of observation distill it into kind of one set of arguments. Okay, so I mentioned before about when I started the project that kind of MOOCs were treated as the sort of like solution to all our educational problems. But as last year wore on, as most of you know have been following MOOCs, there was a backlash, okay? And some people who had never sort of experienced kind of educational technology or really technology life cycles, kind of were shocked at the speed at which this thing turned from sort of, angel to devil. But, those of us who are familiar with the hype cycle, knew what was going on. Everybody familiar with the Gartner hype cycle? Yeah. Okay. So for those of you who are not, this is Gartner Group developed this as a way to explain the sort of process that new technologies sort of enter a marketplace. What happens is you have a technology trigger. Sometimes it's a new invention, but it's just an old technology finally becoming affordable or finally becoming workable. A great example of this is ebooks, right? Ebooks were around for years, different technology platforms. There's still too many technology platforms, different people cutting different deals with different publishers, but it was the Kindle that was the technology trigger, right? Amazon put its marketing muscle behind its own device. Publishers signed on, and suddenly ebooks were mainstream. That was the technology trigger. And then, boom, you get this peak of inflated expectations. This doesn't happen with every technology, but certainly, with some technologies, this is the transformation. In the case of ebooks, anybody involved with print in any way is doomed. I was in educational publishing when that was going on, and print is dead. It's all all the time. In the case of MOOCs, right, we saw something similar. The technology trigger there was really the sort of founding of companies like Udacity, Coursera, and edX that were bringing these courses that tens of thousands, or if not hundreds of thousands of people were signing up for. Okay, and then bang, this was the peak of inflated expectations that this was going to transform education. But at some point, nirvana does not arrive, because this expectation is not just that this is going to make dramatic change over time, that's going to transform everything tomorrow. And, in the case of ebooks, right, that suddenly people were realizing, what, I actually like my print books, or this ebook, looks really ugly compared to the print book that I've been buying, whether it's art or cookbooks or whichever, or, or eccentric form factors, et cetera. So suddenly it's like, people just turn. It's like turning on a rock star, And in the case of MOOCs, it was like, MOOCs are are teaching 100,000 people at a time. The trough of disillusionment was MOOCs have a 95% dropout rate. That was the argument. So, your numbers are ridiculous. Who would trust an educational platform where you had any professor who had 95% dropout rate would be fired on the spot? MOOCs are a joke. Okay, but over time you sort of inch your way up to what's called the slope of enlightenment. Where the technology kind of finds its home. It's not going to necessarily be as transformative as you would see in a peak of expectations, but it hits a plateau of productivity, like we are now with ebooks, right? Ebooks seem to coincide very nicely with print books. Probably they'll slowly, over time, gradually take the place of more and more print options, but they found their home. And right now we are sort of at I would say, the early stages of the slope of enlightenment, because MOOCs, we know they're not going to transform education tomorrow, right? The people taking them are not even necessarily the people who go to college at that 18 to 22 year cohort. There are other people taking them for other reasons. But now we're thinking, well, who are those people? Why are they taking them? These things are still educating thousands and thousands of people. Even during the trough of disillusionment, when everyone's saying these things are a joke, you couldn't start a MOOC without 50,000 people registering. So there's some action there. Okay, so to a certain extent, I feel like now we're in the most interesting phase of MOOCs, because we know what it's not. It's not going to be an immediate replacement for traditional education, but we're just now trying to think about what they are, right? It's not bad that Harvard and Yale and Stanford are giving away their best courses for free, right? There's nothing evil about that, but why is it good? And that's, I think, where we are right now. Just to give you a sense of what we do know now, which we didn't know most of last year. We now have a sense of what's going on inside a MOOC, right? It used to be 160,000 people signed up, Glory be, this is the solution to all our problems. No, we have a 95% dropout rate. This is a disaster. But point of fact, those numbers really never made sense. That, people who sign up for a course do it for all kinds of different reasons. Some people like me plan to take it to the end and do all the work and treat it like a real college course. Some people just wanted to watch the lectures, like I used to do with iTunes U lectures. They're auditors, but they're getting some educational value out of it. Some people just were checking it out. It was the equivalent of breezing through a college catalog. The metaphor we used of the college classroom, where everybody hitting the enroll button on the edX site is the equivalent of a student signing up for a course at college, was wrong, right? That it may be just somebody breezing through a college catalog. One of my favorite examples of this, when Anant Agrawal went on the Colbert Report, the enrollments in edX went up like 300%. Okay, but of course, and a lot of those people finished, but a higher percentage of people in that cohort didn't finish, right? They were just curious. So, either, Colbert personally made MOOCs worse by screwing up the statistics, or people are spread out across a continuum that needs to be examined. In this case, this was from Harvard, one of Harvard's courses, and you can see, the pick up on the recording, but there's a use case for every type of learner, right? I would be up there, the completionist on the upper right, probably around 82%. That's what I got in that course. But you can see a lot of people have taken that course for the purpose of finishing it. But you can also get a large number of people who did nothing. They did none of the assignments, but they listened to all the lectures. They're listeners or auditors. And then these numbers of people who kind of never did anything, they're browsers, and other people spread out over an entire continuum. Okay? So now we have a sense of what people are doing in MOOCs. So what does it mean? It means that both numbers that we were judging MOOCs by last year are not the numbers we should be using, right? 100,000 enrollments, they're not really enrollments. 95% dropouts, they're not really dropouts. What you're doing is getting lots of people showing up, looking at the options, and several thousand of them finishing it, and probably several thousand more getting the educational value they want out of the course, even if they don't get a certificate. Some other numbers in terms of who's taking a MOOC, probably many of you are familiar with this, is about 70 to 75% of people who enroll in a MOOC already have a degree. I'm one who falls into that 30.1% band. I've got a BA, but an even larger group has an advanced degree. There's some number of students are college students, some are younger. Okay, so you have a interesting spread, but even this doesn't tell the whole story. That some of the postgraduates, they may be taking courses within their profession, right? Harvard's doing quite a number of courses on public health. Okay, and in those cases, you actually want people with degrees who are in the public health professions taking these courses, right? There's more social good that comes out with somebody with a master's or PhD in medicine or public health taking these courses than there would necessarily be with an 18-year-old taking it. Okay, so the purposes behind courses, the value of them, the value to a student and the value to society is, again, should not be simply judged by the notion of are enough 18 to 22-year-olds taking these courses to make them the equivalent of what they would used to have to pay $50,000, $60,000 a year to attend. So, just sort of finishing up on this sense of trends, I think we, even with the notion of MOOCs not rocking traditional education to its foundation immediately, there is some important, what I call academic culture shock that the simple existence of MOOCs, the emergence of MOOCs brought to the academy. For starters, colleges that used to think of their courses as valuable assets, property that needed to be protected, there's been a cultural change. This is actually it's our mission to share these resources with the widest number of people in the world. That is a result of MOOCs making courses available to the whole world, and to a certain degree the mania of kind of joining the MOOC bandwagons was to take things that used to be considered valuable property, protected intellectual property, and treating it like a shared asset. There's been a shift in sort of teaching versus research. I'm sure everyone's aware of the conflict between, in particular, research institutions, how much professor time should be spent doing research versus how much professor time should be spent doing teaching. Is that balance out of whack? But in fact, MOOCs have created a sort of cultural shift where suddenly, people are rock star professors. Suddenly, kind of teaching and learning and research related to teaching and learning is suddenly considered something of value within institutions that might have previously valued publication. So you're seeing that shift, particularly at places like Harvard and MIT. A prioritization of educational research. That data I showed you is just some of a whole bunch of data that Coursera and edX and other MOOC providers are making available, either digested or raw, to inform course development, but also kind of new techniques in education and flipping the classroom. A lot of that is now being informed by data with hundreds of thousands of data sets, something you really could never do with kind of research based on traditional classroom. It's informing course development. Courses I took towards the end of last year were much different than courses I took earlier in the year, because information from the first generation of MOOC courses was rapidly informing development in the second generation, and certainly courses being developed now. And then you've got, the sort of MOOCs were really represented as sort of fusion of academic, engineering, and entrepreneurial culture. The speed at which this thing unfurled, for an academic project, I would guess most of you have sat on committees, on committees within a school. You know how fast universities usually move and make kind of dramatic political decisions, right? This all happened within 24 months, less, sort of 18 months, and boom, and I'll go visit like Harvard X offices, and you've got, classics professors sitting next to video editors, sitting next to engineers. This thing's moving with the speed of internet startup. This is a new thing being brought into academia, and to many extent, I don't have time to describe it now, but if you, read the book, or I can get into it later during Q&A, I would say, as we try to define what a MOOC is, I would say this whole culture of experimentation probably provides, a definition I would sort of urge us to consider when we think of when is something a MOOC versus not a MOOC. And then I think it also puts schools on notice, right? Back when we were saying MOOCs are going to trash traditional education, there was a reason for that, right? It wasn't because traditional education was bad. It's because traditional education is pricing itself beyond the reach of too many. I've been writing quite a bit this year on the cost of college, but when you're talking, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year, we're talking about $1 trillion in debt. Suddenly people were looking for a technology solution to all these problems. And as it turned out, MOOCs were not that. But it did, the excitement over the possibility of taking a wrecking ball to traditional institutions, even if it faded, did put those institutions on notice that something's got to change, because possibly the next technical innovation that comes along will gain widespread mainstream acceptance and will provide a real alternative to traditional college education. So I think I saw more conversation about controlling the cost of college, or at least understanding it last year, than I think I've seen in the past. And I think MOOCs themselves really threw down a gauntlet to online learning. I've taken online courses before. I've taken graduate level online courses. The MOOCs I took were better than all those. Right, the production values, the imagination, the kind of interesting way to engage students through video, dwarfed anything I've seen in courses that I spent thousands of dollars to take on other platforms. You've got this move away from sage on stage lecturing, right? My China X course in Chinese history, part of that took place in China. Part of it took place in every museum at Harvard that has anything to do with Chinese culture or history. I was able to not just look at an artifact, but rotate it. My science and cooking course, I was doing experiments in my own kitchen. So real world activity was translating into a MOOC. And that gets us into sort of some of the creative assignments that you're seeing in MOOCs. People say, well, what is a MOOC? It's a video lecture and a bunch of multiple choice questions. Well, some of them are just that, and I would concur that, testing is probably one of the weakest areas of MOOCs. But I also saw some really creative work that you couldn't do in the classroom, right? That Think Again course that critical thinking course I mentioned, that ended with our crowdsourcing project, an argument contest, right? Rather than peer review each other's arguments, we all entered our arguments in through the comments section that reflected something we learned, and then the student body voted them up and down, and the top winners were analyzed by the professors as to whether they were good arguments and what principles they illustrated. But you can't do that in a course of the classroom of 30. Get tens of thousands of people to contribute hundreds of arguments and then vote on them. You saw other crowdsourcing experiments. Another Duke professor did an experiment where she created a timeline. Kathy Davidson created a timeline where everybody taking the course could post something interesting that happened in their locality in the history of education on this timeline. Right, again, tens of thousands of people contributing to a timeline. That's not something you're going to get in a smaller classroom. Lab work, I mentioned, my science and cooking, I was sort of making macaroni and cheese and measuring the flow of cheese, but you also got David Cox at Harvard had people doing experiments on invertebrates, worms and cockroaches, live experiments where you're entering the data, and why not? These are people who said, don't tell me what you can't do online. You say you can't do experiments. Well, you could do experiments. My sister-in-law taught a course on collage online, not a MOOC, but an online course. So it's not entirely clear these things you supposedly can do in the classroom, you can't do online. The community interaction was actually pretty high. People talk about, the advanced level of many students being a drawback to MOOCs, right? Where's those kind of the give and take you get with 20 to 30 kids in a classroom kind of having a conversation. I'll admit that's missing, but when you have PhDs in the discussion boards in a variety of subjects, actually conversation could be remarkably high. So whereas didn't have necessarily the same give and take of an undergraduate discussion group, some of the input into those discussion groups was remarkably sophisticated. It's one example. I was taking a Shakespeare course at the same time I was taking my Greek literature course, and the first play we read was Troilus and Cressida, which featured Achilles, who bore no resemblance to the Achilles I was hearing about in the Iliad. So I posted on the Greek heroes thing, what gives? And within an hour, somebody chimed in and said, well, actually, Shakespeare would not have had access to the Iliad. Here are the classical sources he would have had access to. Please don't tell me that's something another 19-year-old would have come up with on that. So, there is something to be said for the kind of community interaction. And I think there's something also of working in a familiar environment. There's a lot of talk about, MOOCs are just, particularly what we call X-MOOCs, the kind of MOOCs we take now, those are just moving, conventional classroom courses to the web. And I'll admit that's less revolutionary than other online solutions, but it's also familiar. It was easy for me to gain an on-ramp onto these courses because I knew what to expect. Now, all that said, we got a long way to go. Assessment, generally fairly weak in pretty much all the MOOC courses I've taken. And, I've got a professional assessment background, so, some of the work I'm doing now is with MOOC vendors to try to get them to, get their assessment up to the same quality as other components of the courses. Security is non-existent. It doesn't really matter now because there's no credit for courses, but even so, there's nothing preventing somebody from cheating to a passing grade, other than the fact that it would be idiotic to do so. When learning is your only reward, then why ensure your own ignorance by cheating just to get a certificate that means nothing? But security built into the system now, is non-existent. Discussion forums are very hard to navigate and overcrowded. Frankly, this is one area I really did not have time because I was taking courses at such a frantic rate to really dive into. But when I did dive into them, or contribution was required for the course, I'd find that I would, post a comment, like Justice course, for instance, it required you to comment on 2 questions a week, but you had 50,000 people commenting on the same thing. So first of all, I would comment, write something brilliant, go to the bathroom, and it's down 140 postings, and nobody was responding to anybody because we're all basically writing the same thing. So it was really just discussion going on amongst ourselves. It's better in other areas. I talked about some of the quality content you get, but discussion forums have a long way to go. So the scale really prevents all but the most limited interaction between professors and students. Now, I did see some interesting development over the course of the year. Like, for instance, many courses now have office hours where professors are taking the questions from the forums and addressing them. And that does add a level of intimacy, if not direct interaction. You do get TAs contributing to discussion forums, even the occasional professor. So it's not non-existent, but it's quite limited. The credentials right now have questionable value in the marketplace. You know, that if I went for a job interview with, you know, a big stack of, you know, certificates, I think most employers would understandably say, you know, what the heck are these, you know? But at the same time, that really shows the limitation of our current system, right? Because all people really look at is the name of the university you went to. You know, is it prestigious? Did I go there? Have I hired people from there in the past? You know, and the year you graduated, which is more often than not used for age discrimination. And I say, you know, sort of questionable value. There is value to these because there are students who are, you know, seeking alternative means for education and using MOOCs and other sources to credential themselves, but they're figuring out their own clever ways to communicate what they've done, to what's called signaling your learning. To a certain extent, you know, my project last year was an elaborate signal, and I'm talking to you right now, so obviously it worked. At least to get on this panel. But, and of course, you know, the big question mark hanging over all this is who's going to pay for it all? You know, there doesn't seem to be any lessening interest of students to take MOOCs. There's been a slowing down of institutions jumping on to do them, but not, you know, it hasn't ground to a halt. But I think there is a question, you know, will the venture capitalists behind places like Coursera or the investments that institutions like Harvard, MIT are making in edX, will that go on, if not forever, long enough for these organizations to find some way to at least break even, or in the case of places with venture backing, turn a profit? Okay, so I would say, you know, as you think about the future of MOOCs, you should consider sort of three markets. One is college-age students, 18 to 22-year-olds. You know, currently there are less than a quarter of MOOC students, but remember, you know, the numbers are really high, so a quarter of several thousand means several hundred or several thousand students. So far, they're not interested in credit. On the few occasions when MOOCs have been offered for credit, no one took them up on it. So clearly, they're taking these courses for other reasons. You know, and I guess, you know, if I were to predict a future for MOOCs inside this market, it would be alongside other ways of getting credit for outside of an institution, like AP, like CLEP, like transfer credit or credit by exam programs, one of many solutions as the kind of landscape for higher education evolves. Another group is older learners, right, lifelong learners, you know, but this is really redefining lifelong learning. I actually wanted to study philosophy, you know, I was trying to, and I couldn't justify going and getting a PhD because I actually didn't want a PhD. I didn't want to study at that level. I didn't want to kind of create new knowledge. I wanted to study it as an undergraduate, even though my undergraduate degree, you know, back in the 80s was in chemistry, you know, and I just sort of got new interest over the course of the next several decades. Well, what are your choices as a lifelong learner, right? You know, I guess you can enroll in a traditional, you know, undergraduate university and take your degree again, but that's not really practical. MOOCs offered a way to basically do the equivalent of degree, you know, on my own terms, on my own time, for free. You know, other people are taking courses for professional development purposes. Other people are taking courses just for pure recreational learning. And as I talked about in that example I used, you know, with the person in the discussion group giving me the insight into Shakespeare, you know, we older learners are actually partners in this project. You know, feedback I've given to some of the MOOC providers are actually is informing their courses, you know, from a MOOC student. You know, the openness to new ideas from even institutions like the Ivies is greater now than ever, largely because this is all new territory. And then I think non-traditional learners, we're talking here about developing countries. If you see Anant Agarwal tomorrow give the keynote, I'm sure he'll give you at least one example of courses being taken, MOOCs being taken in Pakistan or Nigeria or in Rwanda, where they're the content of the course. You know, and these people are not sitting around thinking, you know, boy, this course stinks compared to going to Princeton, right? They're comparing it to nothing. And if anyone's familiar with disruption theory, which I don't have time to really get into detail, but you know, the disruptive technology tends to take hold in those places where they don't have an alternative, right? An 18 to 22-year-old in North America has an alternative to MOOCs, right? He can find some way to afford to go to a residential college, and that experience seems to be more appealing than some of the alternatives. You know, but somebody in Rwanda probably doesn't have those choices. So it's in those markets that they're figuring out, okay, what are the shortcomings of MOOCs? Let's work around them. Let's develop our own innovative solutions. And you're already seeing that being re-imported into the developed world through programs like Coursera's Learning Hubs, where online learning is being used in a classroom, whether that's in a U.S. embassy or a adult learning program. So personally, I find the non-traditional learners, whether those be, poor rural communities in the U.S. or developing nations, I think that's the biggest, that's one we should keep an eye on. I wouldn't treat MOOCs as just a charity for those. That's, I think, where we will see the transformative developments that might lead to genuine disruption emerging. Okay, so now let's get to the question that I asked. Are MOOC courses equivalent to traditional college classes? Well, the answer is, it depends. I took enough of them, some of them are, for sure, trying to get as much syllabus material from a traditional college course as possible into the MOOC. For some of the engineering MOOCs from MIT in particular, they've made it their mission to get as much as possible, the only limitation being what the technology can do in terms of assessment. And even there, some very inventive ways to grade things like computer programming courses. My Greek Hero class went for 17 weeks, I think. We did everything that was in the Harvard class. And personally, I think I got everything out of that course that a student in the Harvard class would get. But some courses only went for 6 weeks, 8 weeks. They weren't designed to be the equivalent of full semester college courses. You get a professor who loves teaching this aspect of property and law, and he's been forced for years to co-join that with another subject because of the tyranny of the semester system. Well, MOOCs liberate them to teach just modules or components of the course they like. So in those cases, a MOOC, certainly the MOOCs I take, would not be considered the equivalent of a college course. Some professors, want to really put their kids through the ringer. You take CS50, the famous Harvard computer science course, and you'll be working, 10, 15, 20 hours a week at least on programming assignments. I've taken other courses where even, Justice from Harvard, where, you pass if you can answer 20 multiple choice questions, or I think 80 total multiple choice questions. And that's by intention. They are really much more interested in having students exposed to the material. They don't want to erect hurdles that might prevent students from finishing the class. Okay, so I think a good way to illustrate this is the answer to the second question. Was my degree the equivalent of a 4-year degree program? And since I now have a philosophy degree, pseudo-philosophy degree under my belt, I'm prepared to answer both sides of this question. And if I was to take the prosecution role and say it didn't, I have memories of going to college. I remember what it was like going to college. I remember the amount of work I did going to college. And I take a look at the amount of work I had to put into last year. I think I wrote 14 papers, maybe took, certainly several, dozen tests, but most of those are multiple choice. Didn't really seem like the amount of work. It seemed like more than work than I did in 1 year, but certainly less than I did in 4. And I did a little kind of pseudo calculation while I was doing this project. I took a look at a couple colleges and thought, what if I tried to do 4 years at a residential college in one? Could I make the timing work? That would involve taking, 8 to 10 courses every semester in the summer, and then the timing didn't work. And even if it did, I remember the amount of work that went into a course where a professor assumed that you were taking at most 4 or 5 courses. The notion of doubling that probably wouldn't work. And if I was able to do, if my 1 year MOOC BA I was able to do, but a 1-year residential degree I probably couldn't, and put that to the test, but it's probably pretty likely I couldn't, then the answer must be the courses I took on average were easier than courses you would take. Now that on average is important because I mentioned a few courses, half my papers I wrote for Michael Roth's Modern and the Postmodern. That was certainly more writing than I did in many courses I took as an undergraduate. Some of the Harvard courses I mentioned certainly seemed as demanding as any course I remember in college, but some were less. And I think that's, just falls out of that experience, that the experience I had, while more work than one would normally do in a year of education or online education, was still less than a 4-year degree. Arguing in favor that my 1-year program was the equivalent degree. I tend to I started with a question, but if I were to ask this audience to write the name of every class they took in college, would everybody get all of them? Okay, how about half? Okay, Usually I get like between like a quarter and a half to just, okay, and let's take somebody who at least remembers the name of your courses. What if I gave you the final exam from one of those courses? It's like, this is actually I always get panic and uneasy laughter. But does that mean you learn nothing in college? Obviously not, because if you had a week to prepare, you could probably, dust off your old textbooks or find information on the web. That would refresh the sort of a priori knowledge that you developed while you were in school. And you could probably do okay on the exam. Maybe not the same grade you got, at the end of a semester, but probably do okay or write a paper summarizing the class. So why should we be judging, should your college experience be judged by the courses you took that you can't even name right now? Most of you can't even name right now, or it's what you became through the end of that process. Okay, at the end of my process, I studied philosophy. My final exam, my senior thesis was the MOOC book. My final exam is actually, a friend talked me into going to the APA, the American Philosophical Association conference in Baltimore last year. It's always been Christmas and New Year's. And my final exam was, can I go to that conference and not feel like a moron? Am I in way over my head? And point of fact, I went in and I did just fine. I understood what people are talking about. I even asked a couple of questions that weren't, shot down any worse than some of the PhD's questions were. Even on philosophers I never heard of before, I can understand the arguments people were being made. Because I studied stuff I knew nothing about 12 months earlier. So if college is not these courses, necessarily the courses you took, but what you became, is it necessarily false? Is it necessarily false to say, I am the equivalent of somebody with a BA in philosophy now? Who can MOOCs best serve? I think if there's anything you get out of this talk, there is a range of human experiences that MOOCs are feeding into. All the dots and all the bar graphs don't capture the fact that I got so into, the Odyssey when I was reading it for my Greek heroes class. I was like finishing it in the men's room of Valvoline. They're not capturing the people who are taking these in groups, and having the time of their lives because this is a subject they always wanted to study, and here's a rigorous, demanding way of doing it. They're not taking into account, the kids in Nigeria who this is their only chance to study electrical engineering thanks to these free courses that are being made. So, kind of think of them very broadly. And then finally, are MOOCs a revolutionary technology? Where's the revolution? I think it's not going to come from an immediate transformation of everything we've always seen in education, but you will see, those places that sort of disruptive technology takes hold, those places you don't expect, those places where people have no option, those places where MOOCs are the most exciting thing ever, and they're willing to live with or overcome the shortcomings. So I would say, it is, are MOOCs going to bounce back and then destroy the academy? Who knows, but I'd say it's more likely something that MOOCs are part of or evolve into will certainly impact education as we know it. Okay, and there is all my various contact information, and I think there is more than enough time for some Q&A. Yes?
You talked about really the Tier 1 schools. The Tier 1 schools being the delivery of this, but really, what is that engine? Why, a community college in the middle of Nebraska might actually have content that is a better way to learn. I mean, I'm not sure why I see that should have evolved like this, unless it's the ability to fund.
No, I think, no, it's a good question. Initially there was a push to recruit elite colleges. Coursera was pushing for, whatever that means, sort of elite colleges. And then edX was, probably it's more expensive to develop courses with edX. So probably ability to fund it did come in. I would say, that's broadening out now. You're actually having some places that aren't colleges at all are creating MOOCs for basically training. I've seen a MOOC on bariatric surgery done by a Johnson & Johnson company. So I think there is a broadening out. I'd say, I worked with community colleges for a number of years in my publishing career, and frankly, they were way ahead of the Ivies in terms of, flipping the classroom, leveraging internet content, creating their own online courses. So I'd say part of the reason they might not be jumping at the MOOC opportunity is they're already doing interesting online things, and they're looking at that, organizations like edX and saying, what took you guys so long to realize, there's some value here? So, but I think you'll see you'll see a broadening out, you'll see more things, even now you'll have more things that, are massive, open, and to a certain extent free. The Canvas opening up its platform to the world to create, sort of its canvas.net platform. Some of those course colleges are not, members of the Ivy League. They're other schools that have a lot of content they want to put in. So I would say the eliteness is starting to fade away as more people are kind of playing with the technology. Yes.
Okay, my question was, having been a lifelong learner, kind of like yourself, anybody remember correspondence courses where you receive cassette tapes? Remember those? And you type your paper on a typewriter? Well, that's how I completed my 4-year degree, and they validated your identity by using your driver's license and going to a testing center to take the final exam to get your 3 units. Other courses like other classes, institutions, University of New York, used to have a credit bank where you would transfer units in, and then you would pass the GRE in the subject matter, and that would give you your 4-year degree. So what I've been watching with the MOOCs, what opens it up is the accessibility of it and the convenience of it. The testing and an assessment and units is going to happen. It's just how is it going to be implemented, and I think it's just going to be a reiteration of a similar idea. But the main question I have is, for me, where this fits the best is professional development, because I teach computer science and I help students get jobs, but they have to have street cred to get the interview. What have you done to prove you know what you know? And then say, well, I took this MOOC and I took that one, and then here's the project I did. That helps them get the jobs. It's not just the degree, it's the degree and. And this is, I think that fills the biggest hole. But when's your book come out again?
October. And actually, there's a whole chapter on the history of where MOOCs emerged. It starts with Pittman's Correspondence College, which is teaching shorthand. There's don't have time to get into it, but basically, every time a new communication technology emerges, whether it's print in the mail or radio or television or computers or the internet, one of the first things that happens is it's applied to education. So, there's a direct line between Pittman and what you're seeing here. And I do agree that kind of testing centers, there's a session here on testing centers and MOOCs that I suggest you go see. I'm going to go to. I think it's later today or tomorrow, that will kind of see what's going on. I think the way you tend to get credit now, whether it's through a testing center or some kind of transfer credit, you still have to be enrolled in an institution. You have to be enrolled in an institution, and that institution deigns to give you credit for things that go on off campus. And in a way, that's, MOOCs are kind of doing this thing while colleges are getting more flexible. And not just sort of community colleges, Wesleyan, where I went to, they're talking about and even starting to implement the notion of a 3-year degree. You pay Wesleyan for 3 years, but you do other stuff for that 1 year that they'll count toward graduation. I think you can see more of that, but you still have to be enrolled in an institution. Same way you had to have some relationship with NYU to graduate with your Sunrise semester courses. Computer science, I'd say, is sort of I wouldn't call it a cheat. It's the one that fundamentally you can never go to college at all and be a very successful computer programmer. It's a meritocracy, and so MOOCs can credentialize you. Taking your courses credentialize you. Going to Harvard and taking computer science there could credentialize you, or you could just be a great programmer because you've been programming since the cradle, and that lands you your job. So I'd be more interested in how MOOCs can help you in fields that aren't sort of computer science to get a flavor. But good point, yeah. Okay, I think we're wrapping up here. I'm around. I'll be breaking down and then hanging out outside. So anybody who wants to talk further, I'm happy to stick around as long as you like.